I look forward to presenting the Armed Forces Quadrennial Review in the very near future.
Sir Hugo Swire.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. 5 ships of the Royal Navy have been named after Devon's county capital, HMS Exeter, the first in 1680. So would my right honourable friend not agree with me? It would be entirely appropriate if one of the new frigates continued in that great tradition.
Minister Baldwin.
Well, again, my right honourable friend makes a very compelling case, as have many other colleagues from all parts of the House, for HMS Exeter. I'm sure he will welcome the fact that HMS Tamar is currently in build as an offshore patrol vessel.
Bill Esterson.
It must be in the national interest to retain domestic military aircraft manufacturing capability. So if the government doesn't bring forward the replacement for the Red Arrows, how are they going to guarantee that domestic capacity while military orders are secured for the long term at BAE, given the current shortage of those orders?
Well, my honourable friend makes a very important point, because we do have such strong leadership in this area. But what I would say to the honourable gentleman is this: that it is also important that we show cross-party support for the many export campaigns that BAE Systems are involved with around the world. And I urge him to do what he can with his leader and his front bench to do that.
Jack Lepresti.
Mr. Speaker, well, given that Typhoon is scheduled to leave service in 2040, could I ask my honourable friend what steps she is taking to procure the next generation of fighter aircraft, given the potential opportunities for export, and to preserve and maintain our defence, our sovereign defence capabilities?
Minister.
Well, again, a very important statement of the question and the support that we're giving to Typhoon exports around the world. I was delighted that my right honourable friend, the Secretary of State, was able to sign a statement of intent with Qatar recently. We will continue that effort, as well as considering what our options are in terms of work on a replacement.
Gavin Robinson.
Mr. Speaker, the Secretary of State was most welcome to my constituency 4 weeks ago, albeit to name a ship that was built in Glasgow. So can I ask the Secretary of State, when does he intend to visit Glasgow to announce some naval shipbuilding in Belfast?
Well, I hope the honourable member shared my pride in restoring the name HMS Belfast again to a warship of the line. I will certainly bear his suggestion in mind next time I'm in Glasgow.
Robert Jenrick.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, my constituent Aidan Aslin has just returned to Newark after fighting with the Kurdish Peshmerga and helping to defeat IS in Syria and northern Iraq. He's one of hundreds of British citizens who've done the same. Would my right honourable friend, the Defence Secretary, note the contribution and bravery of these British citizens, but also strongly dissuade other young people from taking this extremely dangerous course in the future?
Well, I certainly note that, and I would advise any British citizen intending or wanting to go to fight against Daesh ISIS. The way to do that is to join our armed forces and get the professional training that's necessary and the respect for international humanitarian law that goes with it.
Angela Smith.
Speaker, it's 35 years since HMS Sheffield was sunk in the Falklands War, and my constituents believe that it's about time the city should have another Royal Navy ship named after our great city. So will the Secretary of State ensure that the committee gives full consideration to making sure we can enjoy the third HMS Sheffield?
Shiny.
Well, Mr. Speaker, the Honourable Lady makes a very poignant appeal for another ship to be named HMS Sheffield, and I'm sure that her representations will have been heard by the relevant committee. And I'm so pleased, Mr. Speaker, that we have so many new ships that we're building in this country that we can have all these new names.
Vicky Ford.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Engineers at BAE in Chelmsford were critical in developing the Samson multifunctional radar, the Seawolf missile tracking radar, and the highly innovative T994 two-dimensional radar. When it comes to the next generation, the ballistic missile defence radar, will the MOD take into consideration employment as well as capability and make sure these skills stay in Britain?
Well, my honourable friend will be pleased to know that we don't need to distinguish between the two things because the radars that are made by BAE Systems are unrivalled around the world.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Whilst agreeing with what the Secretary of State said about Daesh, he will know that one of the things that separates them from us is that we are bound by the rule of law, and specifically by rules of engagement. Can the Secretary of State take the opportunity today to confirm that our conduct will always be bound by the Geneva Convention?
Absolutely. That is one of the things that distinguishes our armed forces from the way in which Daesh has unscrupulously used civilians to prosecute their particular case.
I think we should hear from a member of the Select Committee, Mr. Martin Doherty-Hughes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Secretary of State's own permanent secretary said last Tuesday at the Defence Select Committee on the subject of the F-35 programme, we will not be in a position to be able to give a precise view as to the whole of this very complicated programme will be until 2035. Does that not pay paid to the Secretary of State's incredible claim that the 8 Type 26 frigates will provide work in the Clyde till 2035?
Well, Mr. Speaker, what I would say it puts paid to is it puts paid to anyone who thinks that you can forecast the budget out for 2 decades and get it down with pinpoint certainty, something that I know the Scottish Government might also find difficult.
Order. Point of order. Exceptionally, I will take this point of order now. I think it's germane, and I think occupants of the Treasury bench should hear it. Point of order, Dr. Sarah Wollaston.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It's now more than 4 months since the general election, but still the liaison committee is unable to formally meet to carry out its functions on behalf of this House. Could you, Mr. Speaker, assist us? Because I'm afraid repeated representations from across the House from Select Committee chairs are not yet making a difference in ensuring that all Select Committees are properly constituted.
To the honourable point of order, frankly, it is absurd and indefensible that more than 4 months since the state opening of Parliament, that committee, which of course consists of the chairs of the Select Committee, has yet to be constituted. I might add, almost in parenthesis, because I'm sure that the honourable lady will feel empathy with other colleagues on this front, that the same situation, I think, applies to the European Scrutiny Committee and also to another committee which is not a select committee but which is a committee of Parliament, and a very important committee at that, namely the Intelligence and Security Committee. These committees are there to scrutinise the executive branch. I discussed this important matter in a most cooperative exchange with the Leader of the House at the start of the summer recess, and I know she used her best endeavours with others to ensure the constitution of many of the select committees some little while ago. However, the fact that there are these remaining committees as yet unconstituted is simply not acceptable. Now, it would obviously be most unfortunate if it were necessary for members to keep raising points of order day after day after day after day before these committees were established, and as I'm sure the whole House would want to avoid such an embarrassing fate, I can only assume that proper action will now follow. But the honourable lady is always attentive to her responsibilities, and in the grisly event that it is necessary for her to raise a further point of order, I'm sure she won't hesitate to do so. Statement, the Prime Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And with permission, I would like to make a statement on last week's European Council. Long after we have left the European Union, the UK will continue to be a strong and committed partner, standing alongside our neighbours and working together to advance our shared values and interests. This Council provided a further opportunity to demonstrate that ongoing commitment through discussions that included migration, the digital single market, Turkey, North Korea and Iran. And it made important progress in moving towards the new deep and special partnership with the European Union that we want to see. First, on migration, the UK is playing its full part. The Royal Navy has intercepted 172 smuggling boats and saved over 12,000 lives since Operation Sophia began. while our National Crime Agency is working with Libyan law enforcement, enhancing their capability to tackle the people smuggling and trafficking networks. At the Council, we welcomed the reduction in migrant crossings and the renewed momentum behind the Libyan political process. But we must also continue to address the root causes driving people across the Sahara and the Mediterranean, so the UK is also continuing to invest for the long term in education, jobs and services, both in countries of origin and transit. On the digital single market, it is right to keep up the pressure on completing its implementation by the end of 2018. This will continue to be of benefit to us even after we leave the European Union. At this Council, I also argued that the free flow of data is key to unlocking the potential of Europe's digital trade, and we secured conclusions which recognise this. As the government set out in a paper over the summer, such arrangements will be an important part of the future relationship between the UK and the EU. Turning to the discussions on Turkey, we share the concerns over the arrests of EU nationals and others defending human rights. This is something I raised personally with President Erdogan when we met at the UN General Assembly, and we are publicly calling on Turkey to protect freedom of expression and release those defending human rights. At the same time, I believe we must take a long-term view of the enduring importance of our relationship with Turkey, a vital partner in ensuring a secure and prosperous European neighbourhood. And we must also continue to recognise the challenges they are responding to, not least that they faced a military coup only 16 months ago. So we must continue to work with Turkey as our ally and partner, in particular as we respond to the shared challenges of terrorism, migration and instability in the Middle East. But in so doing, we must do all we can to convince Turkey to demonstrate its commitment to human rights and the rule of law. To turn away from Turkey now would undermine those who seek to secure a European future based on our shared values. On North Korea, we welcomed the EU sanctions adopted last week and reaffirmed our clear condemnation of North Korea's aggressive and illegal missile and nuclear tests. We urged all states, including China, to play their part in changing the course Pyongyang is taking. And on Iran, the Council built on the joint statement made by Chancellor Merkel, President Macron and myself last week, reiterating its firm commitment to the nuclear deal. This deal was the culmination of 13 years of diplomacy and a major step towards ensuring that Iran's nuclear programme is not diverted for military purposes. That is vitally important for our shared security, and we are continuing to work particularly closely with our French and German allies on this crucial issue. Mr. Speaker, turning to our negotiations to leave the European Union, I shared the vision I set out in Florence for a creative and pragmatic approach to a new deep and special partnership between the United Kingdom and the European Union. A partnership based on the fundamental beliefs we share in democracy and the rule of law, but also in free trade, rigorous and fair competition, strong consumer rights and high regulatory standards. I've also been clear that the United Kingdom is unconditionally committed to maintaining Europe's security. Both sides have approached these talks with professionalism and a constructive spirit, and we should recognise what has been achieved to date. On citizens' rights, both sides share the same objective of safeguarding the rights of EU nationals living in the UK and UK nationals living in the EU. This has been my first priority from the very beginning of the negotiations, and it remains so. The negotiations are complicated and deeply technical, but in the end they are about people, and I'm determined that we will put people first. EU citizens make an extraordinary contribution to our national life, and we want them to stay. I know that EU member states also value the UK nationals living in their communities, and I want them to have their rights protected too. We are united on the key principles, and while there are a small number of issues that remain outstanding, we are in touching distance of a deal. This agreement will provide certainty about residence, healthcare, pensions and other benefits. It will mean that EU citizens who have paid into the UK system and UK nationals who have paid into the system of an EU 27 country can benefit from what they have put in. It will enable families who've built their lives together to stay together, and it will provide guarantees that the rights of those UK nationals currently living in the EU and EU citizens currently living in the UK will not diverge over time. We will also ensure that the implementation of the agreement we reach does not create complicated and bureaucratic hurdles, For example, I have said that applying for settled status will cost no more than a UK passport, and that people applying will no longer have to demonstrate comprehensive sickness insurance. We will also do everything possible to work closely with EU member states to ensure their processes are equally streamlined for British nationals living in their countries. We've also made significant progress on Northern Ireland, where it is absolutely imperative that joint work on the peace process is not affected in any way. The Belfast Agreement must be at the heart of our approach, and we have clearly agreed that the unique circumstances across the whole of the island of Ireland will require specific solutions. There will not be any physical infrastructure at the border, and we've also developed joint principles to ensure the continuation of the common travel area. These principles will fully preserve the rights of UK and Irish nationals to live, work and study across these islands, and protect the associated rights to public services and social security. Mr. Speaker, this Council provided an opportunity to assess and reflect on how to make further progress in the negotiations. My speech in Florence made two important steps, which have added a new impetus. First, I gave two clear commitments on the financial settlement that the UK will honour commitments we have made during the period of our membership, and that none of our EU partners should fear they will need to pay more or receive less over the remainder of the current budget plan as a result of our decision to leave. As the House would expect, we are going through our potential commitments line by line, and that detailed work continues. And second, I proposed a time-limited implementation period based on current terms, which is in the interest of both the UK and the EU. At this Council, the 27 member states responded by agreeing to start their preparations for moving negotiations onto trade and the future relationship we want to see. The Council conclusions call for work to continue with a view to being able to move to the second phase of the negotiations as soon as possible. And President Tusk, in his press conference, was clear that the EU's internal work will take account of proposals presented in the Florence speech, and indeed that this agreement to start preparatory discussions would not be possible without the new momentum given by that speech. So, Mr. Speaker, I am ambitious and positive about Britain's future and these negotiations. If we're going to take a step forward together, it must be on the basis of joint effort and endeavour between the UK and the EU. But I believe that by approaching these negotiations in a constructive way, in a spirit of friendship and cooperation, we can and will deliver the best possible outcome that works for all our people. And that belief was shared by other European leaders. Mr. Speaker, we are going to leave the European Union in March 2019, delivering on the democratic will of the British people. Of course, we are preparing for every eventuality to ensure we leave in a smooth and orderly way, but I am confident that we will be able to negotiate a new, deep and special partnership between a sovereign United Kingdom and our friends in the European Union. That is my mission, that is this government's mission, and I commend this statement to the House.
Jeremy Corbyn.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I would like to thank the Prime Minister for an advance copy of this statement. And I also underline the importance of respect for human rights and democracy in Turkey, and say to the government of Turkey, imprisoning journalists and lawyers is not part of that process and is not acceptable. And also that we also need to defend the Iran nuclear deal, which has been rightly defended at the EU Council last week, and we must all do everything we can to defend it to prevent the proliferation of any nuclear weapons. I commend also the service of the Royal Navy in Operation Sophia, which, as the Prime Minister pointed out, has already saved thousands of lives. But in relation to Libya, nothing is more pressing than securing a viable, long-term, peaceful settlement to that country's problems. Given the language used by her Foreign Secretary in this matter, the Prime Minister may need to take a lead on this, just as she's had to take over the lead from her Brexit Secretary on negotiations with the EU. Mr. Speaker, I'm now beginning to feel a very worrying sense of Groundhog Day here. Every time she gives us an update on the progress of negotiations. Only 2 weeks ago, she told this House that her speech in Florence had put momentum into the Article 50 negotiations, and that an agreement on phase 1 of these talks was within touching distance. Well, here we are again, after another round of talks, and we're still no clearer as to when negotiations on Britain's future with our largest trading partner will actually begin, and still no clearer as to what exactly she has agreed to in phase 1 of these talks. Mr. Speaker, in what are the most crucial negotiations of our country's recent history, we're clearly stuck in an impasse. No real progress abroad and no progress at home, especially given the Prime Minister's withdrawal bill has been delayed to presumably allow the government whips to try and pull together the splits in her own party. Maybe she can shed some light on all of this confusion, a confusion that has only been escalated by members of her own government. For instance, the Home Secretary says no deal with the EU would be unthinkable. The Brexit Secretary still maintains no deal must be an option, while the Secretary of State for International Trade says that leaving without a deal would not be the Armageddon that some people project. Really? Does the Prime Minister believe an outcome that is not Armageddon might be setting the bar a bit too low? Mr. Speaker, the Prime Minister will also be aware that leaders of every major business organisation have written to her today urging clarity and quickly. Across the UK, businesses in every region and nation are clear they need a transition deal with the EU to be put in place as soon as possible so they can take investment decisions in order to protect jobs and investment in this country. I know the Prime Minister has talked about the need for an implementation period after we leave the EU, but she hasn't been clear about the terms and conditions of that. Can she tell us now what she means by accepting the same basic conditions in an implementation period? Surely this can only mean remaining within the single market and customs union for the transition period, as Labour has made clear. On EU citizens' rights, the Prime Minister says, again, an agreement is in reach. Can she tell us when the detail of that agreement will be ready to bring to this House? And more importantly, to all those people in this country and in the EU who are desperate to know what their future holds for them. This could have been dealt with 16 months ago. Instead, families are suffering anxiety, and some European Union citizens are deciding to leave, including nurses from our National Health Service. If that had been resolved, as it should have been, then hundreds of thousands of British nationals would also have the security they need. And will the Prime Minister tell us what will happen to this specific agreement on citizens' rights if her government fails to secure a final Brexit deal with the EU? Will the Prime Minister now do the right thing and guarantee the rights of citizens living in the UK regardless of the outcome of Article 50 negotiations? On the financial settlement, clearly some within the European Union need to stop briefing out astronomical and unacceptable numbers. But will the Prime Minister confirm reports that she privately assured European leaders that Britain would pay more than the offer she had previously made in her Florence speech? If this is the case, is she confident this would pass the red lines set out for the Foreign Secretary a few weeks ago? Mr. Speaker, the Prime Minister hails the progress she has made so far in these negotiations. The biggest battle the Prime Minister faces isn't so much with the 27 European states, the Chancellor so deftly described as the enemy. It's her battle to bring together the warring factions of her own cabinet and party. And the Prime Minister is too weak to do anything about it. The outcome of crashing out with no deal to become a deregulated tax haven, the dream of a powerful faction of her backbenches and her frontbenches, would be a nightmare for people's jobs and living standards. Labour's message is different and clear. Only Labour can negotiate a Brexit and deliver an economy...
Order. The Prime Minister's statement was heard with courtesy, and so will the response be. No further discussion, no comment required. That's the situation. Jeremy Corbyn.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I was making it clear. Labour's message is different and very clear indeed. Only Labour can negotiate a Brexit and deliver an economy that puts jobs and living standards first. And that's what we're ready to do.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. First of all, can I welcome the comments that the Right Honourable Gentleman made on the Iran nuclear deal. I think it is important that across this House we agree that we should continue to support that deal. I also agree with him that, of course, what we want to see in Libya is a peaceful settlement that can enable that country to be stable and peaceful into the future. And I think it's important that we all support the work that is being done by the UN Special Envoy Salome in relation to this particular issue. He asked about the Brexit bill, about what I set out to the European Council was what I set out in my Florence speech and what I have just repeated in my statement. He talked about us making no real progress. Well, we haven't reached a final agreement, but it's going to happen. I'd have a degree of confidence. That we'll be able to get to the point of sufficient progress by December. After the Florence speech, there is a new momentum. The Florence speech was a step forward, and there should be a positive response to the willingness to work on the interim period, and there has been established a momentum. Now, as it happens, those aren't my words, though the words of Chancellor Merkel, the Taoiseach, the Swedish Prime Minister, the Italian Prime Minister, the Polish Prime Minister and the Danish Prime Minister. So I can assure the Right Honourable Gentleman that progress was indeed made. Now, the Labour Party talk about the need to move ahead in the negotiations. Well, if they think it's so important to move ahead in the negotiations, why did Labour MEPs vote against moving ahead in the negotiations? And he talked about the withdrawal bill as if this was something that Labour were very eager to see before this House. If they're so eager about this bill, why did they vote against it at second reading? And in doing so, vote against bringing workers' rights and environmental standards into UK law. And then finally, he spent a long time in his response talking about no deal. Well, I can only assume that the Labour Party want to talk about no deal because they simply don't know what sort of deal they would want. They can't decide whether they want to be in the single market or not. They can't decide whether they want to be in the customs union or not. They can't decide whether they want a second referendum or not. They can't decide whether they agree with free movement continuing or not. And worse than all that, actually they say they would take any deal, whatever the price they were asked to pay. That's not the way to get a good deal for the UK, it's the way to get the worst possible deal for the UK.
Mr. Kenneth Clark.
Mr. Speaker, isn't it clear that damaging delay will be caused if we don't make progress soon? And the main problem is that other European leaders can see that a noisy minority in the Cabinet and on the backbenches of her own party have persuaded themselves that no deal at all is completely desirable. And this causes them to doubt whether she's able to produce a clear picture of where she eventually wants to go, and whether she's able to produce a majority here for any agreement they have with her. So has she considered, she may have done already, appointing some trusted minister to make approaches to leading members of the opposition parties to see if they will live up to some of the things that the leader appears to say, and perhaps do better, so that at least we can have a consensus in this Parliament in the national interest on the outline of a transitional deal, at least, that would enable us then to negotiate the final details of an arrangement that the majority of this House could agree is in the long-term interests of the United Kingdom.
Well, I have to say to my right honourable and learned friend, that did sound rather like a job application. Can I just say to my right honourable friend that what was clear from my interaction with European leaders is that they recognise that the vision that I set out in the Florence speech for that deep and special partnership for the future, and also for the implementation period, did bring clarity into the thinking of the United Kingdom. It is now, and they have, the 27 have agreed, that it is now for them to consider what they want to see from the future of that relationship, so that that next stage of those negotiations can indeed begin.
Sir Ian Blackford.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and can I also thank the Prime Minister for an advance copy of her statement. Mr. Speaker, I welcome some of the conclusions from the Council Summit, particularly on migration and the stronger commitment on resettlement. We on these benches also welcome the united approach on sanctions against North Korea and fully endorse the EU's call for it to abandon its nuclear and ballistic missile programme. However, Mr. Speaker, it is of deep concern that the ongoing crisis in Catalonia was not covered. EU citizens were brutally thrown to the floor while exercising their right to vote. A parliament stripped of its constitutional status. Can the Prime Minister tell the House what representations she made to address this democratic outrage? Mr. Speaker, last week the EU 27 voted unanimously to declare that there had not yet been sufficient progress on leaving the EU. It is clear that the negotiating sticking points are the same as before, on the financial settlement, EU citizens' rights and the Irish border. Jean-Claude Juncker made a poignant remark. Nobody explained in the first place to the British people what Brexit actually meant. How true, and no wonder this government is in such a mess. Today, the UK's 5 biggest business lobby groups have called for an urgent transition deal. Time is running out for the business community, and financial institutions are already giving notice of leaving London. Ireland has clinched deals with more than a dozen London-based banks to move operations to London. Ernst & Young have warned that 83,000 city jobs could be lost if the UK loses its euro-denominated clearing rights. Mr. Speaker, businesses need certainty, and we need to know the details of our future trading relationship and any transition deal before the end of the year. It is absolutely critical that we stay in the single market and the customs union. Will the Prime Minister end her government's catastrophic ideological flirtation with a no-deal scenario? Take this off the table and do it today.
Can I, first of all, say to the right honourable gentleman that I have spoken to Prime Minister Rajoy on the issue of Catalonia on a number of occasions, including when I saw him at the European Union Council. We are absolutely clear that the referendum had no legal basis. We want to see people upholding the rule of law and upholding the Spanish Constitution. Now, on the wider issue that he talks about in terms of the future relationship of the United Kingdom with the European Union, I've set out the vision that we have for that, and as I've just said in answer to the Leader of the Official Opposition, the EU 27 will now be looking at their vision for this. But I'm sorry that I have to repeat again to the right honourable gentleman, because this is an issue he's raised in the past, that full membership of the single market and full membership of the customs union go with the jurisdiction of the European Court of Justice and freedom of movement. These are issues which were voted against when people voted to leave the European Union. They would effectively mean that we would remain in the European Union, and we are going to leave in March 2019.
Mr. Ian Duncan Smith.
Mr. Speaker, may I say to my right honourable friend that she may wish to answer some of those who want certainty by reminding them that you cannot have agreement on an implementation period until you have something to implement first and foremost? And secondly, could she explain that during the course of her discussions, the private ones she had, the ones that the acting president of the European Union, Martin Selmayr, hasn't actually put into the papers, but her private discussions, could she just say whether she reminded her colleagues in the European Union that to reach a proper free trade arrangement, they will need to have concluded those discussions before the summer of next year? Otherwise, it will be difficult to get those through in times both in the European Union or here. And did she get an answer about, therefore, when they might like to start?
Well, can I say thank my right honourable friend, because he's absolutely right. As we have said on a number of occasions, the point of the implementation period is to put in place the practical changes necessary to move to the future partnership, and in order to have that, you need to know what that future partnership is going to be. He asks about, I have obviously in my discussions with other leaders raised the issue of the timetable that we have, and of course the ultimate timetable that was set by the Lisbon Treaty. My right honourable friend talks about knowing the details of the trade deal by next summer. Of course, Michel Barnier himself has suggested October 2018 might be the point at which it would be necessary to know that. But my right honourable friend is absolutely right that, of course, there will need to be a period of time for ratification of any future arrangements by the various national parliaments. And as we know, that can be more than one in some of the countries concerned.
Hilary Benn.
Mr. Speaker, can the Prime Minister explain why it is frequently said by those with whom we are negotiating that they do not know what the UK wants when it comes to a long-term deal? And does she think it has anything to do with the fact that the Cabinet appears not to have reached its own view yet about what the nature of that deal is going to be?
This is a negotiation, and there will be different levels of detail at different stages of the negotiation. I have set out the vision for our future partnership, and as I've said in response to a number of remarks now, what happened at this European Council was that the EU27 agreed that they will now start the work of preparing their vision of what that future partnership will be, so that when we come to open formally those trade negotiations, both sides have got that agenda and clearly know what those negotiations will cover.
John Redwood.
Given the wish of business to deal with uncertainties, which is understandable, would the Prime Minister agree that the best course for a business trading with Europe would be to prepare for a smooth transition to WTO trade terms, which this government can and will guarantee unilaterally, but to expect the Prime Minister to have good luck in bringing back something better?
Well, I think it's absolutely right that it's important that business prepares for a smooth and orderly move to the future relationship that we have. That's why I've proposed this implementation period, and I believe that's in the interests of businesses not just in the United Kingdom, but also in the European Union. But as my right honourable friend says, we are working to get the good deal, which I think also will be not just in our interest, but in the interests of the EU27 as well.
Yvette Cooper.
Mr. Speaker, further to her answer to the member for Chingford, the Brexit Secretary said last week that a transition phase will be triggered only once we have completed the deal itself. And I understand her spokesperson said today the implementation period is a bridge to where you're heading and you need to know where you are heading. Could she clarify, is she saying today that if we haven't got a long-term trade deal agreed by this time next year, then there won't be any transition deal at all, and Britain will end up on WTO terms by March of 2019?
Well, can I say to the right honourable lady, as I've just responded to my right honourable friend, the member for Chingford, an implementation period is about a period which is adjusting to the future relationship. That's the basis on which I've put it forward to the European Union, and that's the basis on which we'll be negotiating an agreement on it.
Sir William Cash.
In relation to any implementation period, will my right honourable friend accept that it is a potential bear trap if there is a direct involvement of the European Court, whose case law asserts supremacy over our Parliament and over our courts, and includes a commitment to the Charter of Fundamental Rights and political integration?
As my honourable friend knows, I've been very clear that one of the intentions of people voting to leave for the UK to leave the European Union was to ensure that in the future the jurisdiction of the European Court of Justice no longer covered the United Kingdom. When it comes to the implementation period, we will of course have to negotiate the basis of that implementation period if we are going to ensure that we have the greatest possible certainty for business during that period. Then it will be necessary, I think, for us to see as little change during that period as is commensurate with that certainty for business. Indeed, one of the purposes of the EU withdrawal bill is, of course, to bring the acquis, the EU acquis, EU law, into UK law to give that certainty to businesses and individuals here.
Sir Vincent Cable.
Until recently, the British government was leading the negotiations in Europe to create a digital single market benefiting creative industries. Can she explain how she expects to be taken seriously, in the words of her statement, to aim for completion of the single market by 2018 when she's in the process of trying to leave it?
Can I say to the right honourable gentleman that the United Kingdom continues to lead in the debate on the creation of the digital single market. We believe that this is important for the EU 27 and it's important for the UK in or out of the European Union. So we will continue to negotiate during the period that encourage the digital single market during the period we're members of the European Union. But I believe it's important for us once we leave the EU that that digital single market has indeed been created and we will forge a new relationship and a new partnership with it.
Anna Soubry.
Very much indeed, Mr. Speaker. Can I commend the Prime Minister's statement and the progress that she has made in these negotiations. Mr. Speaker, as we've heard, representatives of British businesses of all sizes, from all sectors, have written today to the government warning of the consequences of no deal and relying on World Trade Organization rules. They said the government should give certainty to business by immediately ruling this option out under any circumstances. Will the Prime Minister agree to listen to British businesses, and would she even go so far today as finally to rule out no deal?
Can I say to my right honourable friend that we have, of course, been engaging with business, we've been listening to business. I was very clear that the implementation period was something that business was very keen on having and ensuring that they had that smooth and orderly process of withdrawal. But we are in a negotiation with the EU 27, and I think it is important to remember as part of that negotiation that if we want to get a good deal for the United Kingdom, I think the best way to get a bad deal for the UK is to say that we will accept anything that they give us, regardless. We have to be clear that what we are working for is a good deal. But I'm optimistic about that because we have made some progress, and I believe that the good deal that we're seeking is in the interests of both sides.
Mr. Christopher Leslie.
Isn't it the case that the business community will be shocked to hear the Prime Minister's words today, which seem to suggest that there will be no clarity on transition or implementation until we get a final deal in some number of months or possibly longer ahead? It's the cliff edge that the business community want to know will not be there in March 2019. Will she not give a commitment now to treat this attaining a transitional arrangement separately from trying to get this final deal?
As I set out in my Florence speech the concept of the implementation period, and of course we have to discuss that with the EU 27. But I'm confident that we are going to get a good deal precisely because getting a good deal is not just in our interest, it's in the interests of the EU 27, of the remaining European Union as well. That's what we're working for and that's what our effort is going into.
Ah yes, a Lincolnshire knight. Sir Edward Lee.
May I commend the Prime Minister's approach based on the Florence speech, which I think is entirely sensible, pragmatic and moderate. But may I also encourage her, given that we are being entirely open about our negotiating tactics, namely that no European nation should be worse off, or indeed any EU citizen, may I encourage her to be more transparent and open with Parliament on the figures. I know the reserve position of Whitehall is that Parliament is a nuisance, but what else was Brexit about except reviving parliamentary democracy? We still have no idea what we've offered, what they're demanding. I think we could do with some more information, because ultimately there will be a vote on this in this House, and that will be a vote that counts.
Can I say to my honourable friend that, of course, we have said that there will be a vote on the deal in this House, and we expect that to be a vote that will take place before the European Parliament votes on the deal in this House. I've also said, and I said this in my Lancaster House speech in January, that when we are able to make information available, we will make that information available. But as my honourable friend and others may recall, I also said that we weren't going to give a running commentary on the details of the negotiations, and I think that's important because we must not put this country in a position where we have set out publicly everything that we are looking for in these negotiations, because of course that just hands the cards to the other side. This is a negotiation, and both sides will have to move on it.
Pat McFadden.
Speaker, given the report from the business groups today calling for transition, and given the lust for the cliff edge being displayed by some on her backbenches, perhaps she could introduce some facts. Could she list any major economies in the world which trade with the EU on the basis of WTO rules alone, with no sectoral or other agreements in place?
Can I say to the right honourable gentleman, the premise of his question is false, in that he seems to be suggesting that the purpose of the government's negotiations are to somehow engineer a no-deal scenario. They are not. We are working to a deal. We're working to a good, deep and special partnership for the future relationship for this country with the European Union, to cover both trade and security relationships.
Nicky Morgan.
Very much indeed, Mr. Speaker. Can I follow that up? Because the tenor of the Prime Minister's negotiations last week and her statement to the House today is very much, as she said, to seek a creative and pragmatic approach to a new deep and special partnership. And partnership is the key word, is it not? Because no partnership is possible without dialogue within this House, with European neighbours and fellow member states, and in the Cabinet. So can the Prime Minister assure us that those talks will continue, and that she will not listen to those, unfortunately on these benches sometimes, who want talks to stop and us to go on to WTO rules?
I can assure my right honourable friend that the negotiations are continuing. As I've said, we want to ensure that we have work to, it's what we're doing, we're working to getting a good deal. The purpose of my Florence speech was to set out that vision for that deep and special partnership in the future, and it is that partnership that the government is working towards.
Joanna Cherry.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. There's been much talk today of the time-limited implementation period which the Prime Minister referred to in her Florence speech. Others have referred to it as a transitional deal. Can she tell us whether there has been any discussion with the EU27 as to what the legal basis of such a transitional period would be? Would it be Article 50 or would it be something else?
Well, I can say to the Honourable Lady that the European Union themselves actually raised a similar concept to the implementation period in their April guidelines, and that would be on the basis of the Article 50 process.
Mark Francois.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. On the matter of North Korea, the Defence Select Committee recently took evidence from a group of academics who argued that North Korea may already have an ability to reach the United Kingdom with a thermonuclear weapon. If that be true, does the Prime Minister agree it would be the utmost folly to abandon our independent nuclear deterrent?
Well, I can absolutely agree with my honourable friend that it would be folly to abandon our independent nuclear deterrent. I think there are many reasons why it's important for us to maintain our independent nuclear deterrent, and of course, as Parliament has voted, to upgrade that independent nuclear deterrent. It's important because it is also part of the collective defence of Europe that we provide as a member of NATO.
Stephen Doughty.
Mr. Speaker, the government position on the Brexit negotiations is simply absurd. The Prime Minister just a moment ago refused to rule out no deal. The Brexit Secretary was threatening no deal last week, and the Home Secretary was saying it was unthinkable. And my question, Mr. Speaker, is what is this going to cost the British taxpayer? The Home Secretary told us that £50 million was already being spent this year on contingency planning in her department. How much is now being spent across government, and how many nurses, doctors or police could that paid for?
Well, I can tell the honourable gentleman that, in fact, I have already said at this dispatch box that the Treasury has set aside for this year £250 million to be spent across government departments in preparing contingencies for every eventuality.
Vicky Ford.
May I congratulate the Prime Minister on the great progress and change in tone of the negotiations. May I particularly thank her for the progress that has been made on the citizens' rights issue, and may I ask her to give us more detail of the areas where agreement has been cemented.
Yes, well, I can say to my honourable friend that there are a number of areas where agreement has been reached, particularly in relation to issues such as payments on pensions and healthcare arrangements for citizens, both EU citizens here in the UK and UK citizens in the European Union. There's a small number of areas where we have yet to reach agreement, but as I also said in my statement, I think it's clear from both sides, from the UK but also Michel Barnier and the European Union, that we can see the shape of that deal and that we are in with touching distance of getting there.
Ian Paisley.
Very much, Mr. Speaker. I too welcome the statement by the Prime Minister and indeed look forward to progress being made, especially after December, whenever we move to phase 2 of the negotiations. However, has the Prime Minister taken the opportunity to remind the Republic of Ireland's Taoiseach that it is about time he started to pull his weight in the interests of the Republic of Ireland, rather than attempting to throw his weight around on the issue of the border, because all that is doing is damaging potentially his economy more than the economy of Northern Ireland. And could the Prime Minister also make an impression on the front bench of the Labour Party when they visit Northern Ireland, and threaten that the peace process is an exchange for Brexit? They are playing with fire, and they ought not to encourage that beast.
Well, I think it is very important that all sides on this issue are very clear that the Belfast Agreement that we must ensure that the Belfast Agreement is put into place and is recognised and respected in its entirety. It's also important, and we want to ensure that the sort of peace programmes that have been possible through our membership of the European Union can continue in the future. And of course, when it comes to the border and resolving the issue of the border between Northern Ireland and the Republic, it will of course be for us to work with the Republic of Ireland government and with the European Union more generally to find the solution that we all want to see, which is, as I say, no physical infrastructure at the border and no return to the borders of the past.
Mr. Bernard Jenkin.
Mr. Speaker, can I reassure my right honourable friend that anyone who's suggesting that she is weak is seriously underestimating her, seriously underestimating this party which supports her, and underestimating the importance of the referendum mandate and the fact that she personally obtained more Conservative votes than any other Conservative leader for 30 years. And will she stick to her guns, follow through and have confidence that, unfortunately, the only people undermining her from this side are people who are threatening to go into the lobbies with the Labour Party?
Well, I'm sure... can I thank my honourable friend for the confidence that he has shown in me. Can I also say to him that I am sure all members of our party want to ensure that we get the best possible deal for the United Kingdom. That's what the government's working to, and I look forward to everyone on these benches supporting us.
Mr. Ben Bradshaw.
Did the EU Council discuss Russia? And in this context, has the UK government or its agencies been asked for help or information by the American congressional team or the US Special Counsel Robert Mueller investigating alleged Russian subversion of the US presidential election?
Well, as it happens, I can say to the right honourable gentleman that, in fact, on this occasion, Russia was not one of the subjects on the agenda of the European Union Council. As I say, we did discuss a number of foreign policy issues. North Korea, Turkey, DPRK were all on the agenda, but Russia was not.
Ah, yes, the good doctor. Dr. Julian Lewis.
If our EU friends were to demand a sum of, say,
trillion pounds rather than 100 billion, the position of the opposition would have to be to accept that because they wouldn't walk away under any circumstances. Given that we would walk away under unacceptable circumstances of that sort, can the Prime Minister reassure us that all necessary preparations will be made so that we can walk away without a deal if we need to, which will, of course, maximise the prospect of getting a good deal and not having to walk away?
Well, can I say to my honourable friend that indeed we are ensuring that government is preparing for all contingencies. That's a sensible, pragmatic approach for any government to take. Of course, we're working for a deal, as I've set out in answer to earlier questions, but can I also thank my honourable friend for very graphically illustrating the position that's been taken by the Labour Party, which is that they would simply pay any price for a deal, whatever.
Liz Kendall.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Prime Minister says she wants a deep and special partnership with the EU, but some of her colleagues want a total and complete break. Isn't the truth that her failure to resolve this fundamental issue is what stalled the negotiations and put the future of our country at risk?
Yes. No, the honourable lady obviously failed to recognise the progress that was made at the European Union Council and the decision that was taken that the EU27 will now be preparing for their position in the negotiations on the future partnership and an implementation period in the lead up to that partnership. They recognised that we had, as the United Kingdom, in the Florence speech, I'd set out our vision for what that future partnership would look like, and it's now for them to look at what they believe that partnership should be in the future, and that's exactly what they're doing.
Mr. Patterson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Last year, the European Union had a surplus with us of £71.8 billion. A report last week said that if we moved to tariffs, the German auto industry alone would lose 29,000 jobs. Was there any realisation at all during her discussions of the impact of not discussing free trade arrangements, because it is massively in the interests of our partners to maintain reciprocal free trade? And do they understand that they would lose far more if we moved to WTO than we would?
Now, I say to my honourable friend, I think it is very clear that across the European Union it is recognised that we need to look at what a trade relationship in the future might be, precisely because, as I've said, as he has said and others, this is not just about the United Kingdom's future position, it's also about jobs and the economies in the EU27 as well. And I think there is a recognition that that's, and as I say, the EU27 are now looking at what they think that partnership could be for the future. And of course, I'm sure my right honourable friend is aware, there are a number of organisations on the continent now starting to talk about the importance of this relationship for their businesses in the future.
Heidi Alexander.
Mr. Speaker, could I ask the Prime Minister a question that the Brexit Secretary was unable to answer last week? Given that the government now envisages a 2-year transition period where the existing structures of rules and regulations apply, can she clarify whether a pharmaceutical company wanting an authorisation to market a new cancer drug in the UK during transition would do so via the European Medicines Agency or a new system as yet undefined?
Can I say to the honourable lady that the intention of the implementation period is, as far as possible, to ensure that there isn't a cliff edge so people are able to operate on the same basis as they do at the moment as they put in place the necessary changes to leading up to the future partnership. Now, of course, that implementation period, which is now going to be looked at by the EU27, is something that will be part of future negotiations.
John Whittingdale.
Does my right friend agree with the Select Committee on the exiting the European Union that it would be in the best interests of both sides if we could conduct negotiations on the divorce settlement in parallel with those on our new relationship? And does she therefore agree further that any flexibility on the size of our exit payment must be linked to flexibility in other areas to be negotiated?
I say to my right honourable friend that I and the government have been very clear that the whole question of that financial settlement cannot be finally settled until we know what the future partnership will be. It isn't that we're going to sign up to a bill and then negotiate what that future partnership will be. So it will be the case that once those formal negotiations on the future trade relationship have started, and of course the security and relationship have started, there will continue to be negotiations on issues which were initially identified as in phase 1.
Stella Creasy.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Since the Brexit vote, there's been a 96% drop in EU nurses registering to work here. With a vacancy in the NHS rate of 86,000 and rising, just how much bigger does that crisis have to get before this government stops using these medics as bargaining chips and does something to make sure that there are nurses and doctors in our A&E this winter?
Well, first of all, I want to reiterate the point that I made in my statement and have made on a number of occasions, that we value the contribution EU citizens have made here in the United Kingdom and we want them to stay. She talks about numbers of nurses. Of course, there are more nurses in the NHS today than there were in 2010. And we have taken off the limit on the number of nurses who can be in training, and there are 52,000 nurses in training, and there were 2 applicants for every nurse training place here in the United Kingdom.
Mr. Speaker, does my right honourable friend agree that this progress achieved at the Council meeting demonstrates again that there's a weight of logic on both sides, both ours and the EU, that lends itself to a deal being done? But would you reassure the House that in the important weeks ahead, every ounce of effort will be marshalled right across members of your government to achieve that end?
Well, I absolutely agree with my right honourable friend that this is in both our interests, and I can reassure him that government as a whole, collectively across every department, is putting the effort necessary into this, in looking at what legislation we need to bring forward, but also at preparing for all eventualities once these negotiations have finished. But the whole effort of government has been put into this.
Annie Lloyd.
The Prime Minister has raised expectations about the situation between Northern Ireland and the Republic, and that's welcome. No physical infrastructure on the border must be welcomed by all parties. But is it conceivable that that can be done without real negotiation between Dublin and London, and of course with Brussels as well? And is it really possible we can talk about no deal in that scenario?
Can I say to the right honourable gentleman that it's not that expectations have been raised this time round in relation to that. That is the position that we have taken and consistently taken since indeed my Lancaster House speech in relation to not wanting to see a return to the borders of the past between Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland. As I said earlier in answer to a question, of course ensuring that we get the solution to that will require us to work not just with the European Commission and with the EU27, but to work hard with the Republic of Ireland government as well.
John Barron.
The Prime Minister is absolutely right not to rule out a no-deal scenario. To do otherwise would be utterly naive. But when it comes to the implementation period, what assurances can she give that it will be indeed strictly time-limited?
Well, I think the key issue about this is that it is about the period of time that is necessary to make the practical changes necessary to move to the future partnership. And of course, by definition, those changes will have a time limit to them. I've said that this would be around 2 years on the current implications of what we're looking at in terms of those practicalities. But it is absolutely essential, I think, that it is time limited, because we will have left the European Union, we'll be moving to a new partnership, and people here in the United Kingdom want to ensure that we get to that partnership and we get to the new arrangement that we are outside the European Union.
Dr. Philippa Whitford. He looks surprised. Reach a precedent and the Honourable Lady doesn't wish to contribute. She's not obliged to do so, but I assume that she would wish to contribute and she's welcome to do so. Let's hear the Honourable Lady.
What we've heard is the possibility of a no-deal Brexit. What about the threat that that would pose through leaving the single aviation market to our entire aviation industry in this country?
Say to the Honourable Lady that, of course, we're aware of the necessity of looking very closely and negotiating those deals in relation to aviation, because we still want people to be able to fly as they are able to do so today. But once again, she's focusing on a no deal when all the efforts of government are being put into actually getting a good deal.
Absolutely splendid. A true parliamentarian is never lost for words. James Dudridge.
Mr. Speaker, whilst we all hope that our European partners start to negotiate on trade, is there not a silver lining if they are unreasonable, in that we will have to move towards WTO rules, and suddenly the French and Germans will realise what a disaster it is for their economies, not ours. They'll negotiate a good deal, not write out the blank cheque that the members opposite want to give them.
Well, my honourable friend is right that I think it is in the interests of both sides. It's in the interests of businesses here in the UK, but also businesses in the EU 27 countries that we get that deal on trade, and that's why we're working so hard for it.
Chris Bryant.
When are we going to have the committee stage of the EU withdrawal bill? I only ask because if there's any, I don't know, hiatus or gap in the legislative programme, there is another bill that has had second reading unanimously, and it was an instant where the Conservatives didn't vote, but that's because they were in support of the bill, and it's the Assault on Emergency Workers Bill. Couldn't we just bring that into committee and have it all the way through its processes by Christmas so that we can stand by our emergency workers?
I note the bid that the honourable gentleman has put in relation to this particular matter. He tempts me to make a business statement here, which I will not do, because of course that is a matter for my right honourable friend, the Leader of the House. But I'm pleased that government is able to support the bill that he's brought forward. I think this is important. We look forward to seeing it on the statute book.
Sir Desmond Swain.
Will she show caution in respect of this suggestion that she reach out to and enlist the support of members opposite, particularly those who have shown their desire to thwart Brexit at every turn by voting against the principle of the withdrawal bill?
Well, with his many years of wisdom, my right honourable friend is right to urge caution on me in relation to this matter, and he's absolutely right. I mean, the Labour Party has tried to thwart the very measure which would enable us to put into place the decision taken by the British people.
Chukwuemeka.
Mr. Speaker, as we've heard this afternoon, there are many members opposite who claim that leaving with no deal and trading on WTO terms will be relatively straightforward. But if we are in a no-deal scenario, we will still need the EU in its capacity as a member of the WTO to at least agree to the new terms of our independent membership of it. Can she therefore guarantee, if there is no deal with the EU, that she will at least get their agreement to the new terms of our independent membership of the WTO?
Can I say to the honourable gentleman that actually the whole question of our membership of the WTO and the independent role that we will take in future once we're outside the European Union is one on which the Department for International Trade is already working, and already working with partners such as the European Union to look ahead to the position that we're going to take.
Mr. Philip Davis.
The reason why this country has been so successful in the past and will be in the future is because of our belief in the rule of law. So therefore, can I urge the Prime Minister to pay the European Union what is legally due to them when we leave the EU, not a penny less, but not a penny more either. If the government has got spare tens of billions of pounds in its coffers, and I'm not sure that it has, then that money should be used to pay for things like social care and for pay rises for public sector workers, not to go into the bottomless pit of the EU and into Jean-Claude Juncker's wine cellar, which I'm sure is rapidly diminishing as we speak. We can't look public sector workers in the eye if we give tens of billions of pounds to the EU that is not needed to give to them legally and hold back their pay at the same time.
Can I assure my honourable friend that, as I said in the Florence speech and have reiterated today, we're clear that we will honour our commitments, but we are going through those commitments line by line. And of course, part of the discussion about those commitments is precisely about the legal nature of those commitments, because we're a law-abiding nation and we want to ensure that we do stand by commitments that we have made, but we're not just going to sign up to anything like the Labour Party.
Catherine West.
Speaker, tomorrow, a number of EU nationals will converge on Parliament to speak to their members of Parliament about a lot of feelings of distress and anxiety. What's the Prime Minister's message to those individuals?
My message to them is that we value the contribution they have made here in the United Kingdom. We want them to stay. That's what we're working for. We've made significant progress in relation to citizens' rights. I've made a number of commitments in an article that I wrote last week to EU citizens living here in the United Kingdom, and I stand by those commitments. We want them to stay.
Mr. Crispin Blunt.
Does my honourable friend agree with me that by some happy accident we've actually ended up in a rather more constructive space for a successful deal, because we're now going to have 2 months of private diplomacy around the future deep and comprehensive trade agreement we will have with our EU partners. But even so, it is necessary for us to prepare for no deal. These talks may fail. And even the fact that Gina Miller agrees with me that we should begin to surface the government's own preparations around the contingency plans, I think these should be, does she agree with me that these should be surfaces, so it's not just the government but also business and people who can begin to make necessary contingency plans?
And I say to my honourable friend that we are working to get the deal that we believe will be in the interests of the UK but also of the European Union for the future. That is where our focus is going. Of course, as I have said, we are working across government to make contingency arrangements for every eventuality. But I've also said, when we go through, as we're in negotiations, we're not going to give a running commentary on every detail of those negotiations, but we continue to work for what I believe is in the best interests, which is to get that good deal for us and for the European Union.
Stephen Kinnock.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Last week I took part in a exiting the EU Brexit Select Committee trip to Dover, which processes 10,000 heavy goods vehicles per day. There we were told that if you add an extra 2 minutes to the customs proceedings, you get an additional 17 miles of tailback going from Dover to Ashford. We were also told that in that context, a no-deal scenario would be a total catastrophe. Can the Prime Minister please explain what measures are being put in place to avoid total gridlock in Dover in the event of a no-deal scenario?
Very good.
Yes, the honourable gentleman.
Northumberland, the honourable gentleman is wittering away from a sedentary position in evident appreciation of the point articulated by his honourable friend, from whose constituency he is himself far distant. It's all very inexplicable. Prime Minister.
I think the honourable gentleman was actually making a point from a sedentary position that actually this would be an issue that would affect others on the other side of the Channel as well as the United Kingdom. But the point is that we have published proposals. The future customs relationship will be part of the negotiations as we go look to the future trade relationship that we will have. But we published proposals in the summer as to a number of options that could be adopted to ensure that we do see as frictionless as possible trade across the border, so that the problem the honourable gentleman has raised does not arise.
Prime Minister, to explain what the honourable member for Blythe Valley was blathering on about, because I couldn't tell. But I'm very grateful for a bit of information. Mr. Peter Bone.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. This morning I met with a gentleman who was singing the praises of the Prime Minister. He was saying that she is determined, yet patient, and gets things done. And I think the whole House would agree with that.
Yeah.
But he went on to say he reads the newspapers and is very concerned about progress not being made and things are terrible. So would the Prime Minister agree with what the newspapers are saying or not? Oh, Mr. Speaker, one other thing. I did ask him what newspaper he read, and it was the Evening Standard.
Well, can I say to my honourable friend, we have a free press in this country, and that's an important underpinning of our democracy. What I know is what the government is doing and what we're doing to ensure that we get that good deal for the future.
Mr. Campbell, I heard you from your seat. Let's hear you on your feet, if you're still interested. Mr. Ronnie Campbell.
Yes, me thinking you weren't going to call me, Mr. Speaker. Saying that we're not in the euro, can't you guarantee that none of the money that the Valley get off with will be used to prop up the union? The euro. A good question. Will that money be used for them? Like the Speaker said, we're not in the euro, so our money shouldn't be used for it. The only problem the Prime Minister's got is some of the Cabinet Ministers is walking up the gangway towards the gala.
Can I say to the honourable gentleman that, of course, this party has a track record of ensuring that we don't have to contribute to propping up the euro, because that's exactly what my right honourable friend, the previous Prime Minister, negotiated when he was in negotiations with the European Union in the past.
Shailesh Vara.
I welcome the statement made by the Prime Minister, and particularly the progress that she has reported to the House. Mr. Speaker, I do not believe that EU citizens living in the UK should have the European Court of Justice as the final arbiter for any disputes when we leave the EU. However, to the extent that this matter remains on the agenda for Brussels, can the Prime Minister give an assurance to the House that Britain is demanding that British citizens living in EU countries will be able to have recourse to our Supreme Court and not the ECJ?
Well, the point that my honourable friend makes actually, I think, shows up in very real way this issue of which court should have supremacy over these issues. What I have said in relation to the citizens' rights, and this is one of the issues that remains on the table, but what I have said is that we will give the certainty to EU citizens here in the United Kingdom by ensuring that that agreement, as part of the withdrawal agreement, is in UK law. I believe that will give them certainty, and that they can then take that as cases to the courts here in the United Kingdom. Now, of course, as happens in any case, and in relation to other courts, not just the ECJ, courts here in the UK do look at judgments that have been made by other courts and matters that are relevant to them. Yeah, right. But the important thing is that it will be through our courts that EU citizens will be able to take their cases. Yeah.
Mike Gapes.
Speaker, the Prime Minister used a new mantra of a deep and special partnership 3 times. Oh. Even though the lack of progress, the business uncertainty and the splits in her government mean that the reality is that this deep and special is actually the new strong and stable. An empty slogan from an empty vessel caretaker Prime Minister.
Gosh, it really is a day of name-calling. I can't imagine it's the sort of behaviour I would ever have indulged in myself. The Prime Minister.
Can I say to the honourable gentleman, what we saw happening at the European Council was the EU27 moving towards their own discussions about what that deep and special partnership will be in the future.
Alex Shelbrooke.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, there are some misguided amnesiacs who think that nationalisation is a good way forward, but there are also some people who think we should stay in the single market. Could my right honourable friend confirm to me that due to state aid rules, you cannot nationalise if you're in the single market?
I think my honourable friend is absolutely right. It is yet again one of the confusions on the Labour Party that shows they really don't know where they're going.
Vera Hobhouse.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Following on from the question of the honourable member from Aberavon, the members of the Select Committee were also told in Dover by a representative of the Port of Calais that they would not build a lorry park in Calais. They could not operate without it. They would not build a lorry park in Calais because of the migrants issues that they have. And actually, the Port of Calais, under the current circumstances, would have to close. Has the Prime Minister considered that problem?
What we have done and what we will continue to do when we are able to when we're onto the negotiations in relation to trade is talk about the future customs relationship that we want to have with the European Union. We've set out proposals for that, and we look forward to discussing those proposals with the EU.
Mrs. Cheryl Gillan.
Speaker, I was very pleased that the Prime Minister confirmed that the UK is fully playing its part over migration, and to hear that the Royal Navy had intercepted 172 smuggling boats and saved over 12,000 lives since Operation Sophia began. But could she confirm that at the summit that the EU reported that it has a looming deficit of 200, or pay gap of £225 million in the money that goes towards migration projects in North Africa? I understand that Germany and Sweden offered more money towards these projects. Could she confirm that and say whether any other EU countries were forthcoming in offering more money to help save lives?
Yes, my right honourable friend is referring to the trust fund that has been established in relation to migration matters and Africa. This is something to which the UK has contributed alongside others. She's right that the Commission reported that there was that deficit. From the United Kingdom's point of view, we are putting extra money into activities in Africa in relation to supporting people in countries of origin and transit. What we're doing is working alongside that trust fund, and the work that we're doing is amounting to £75 million.
Mrs Helen Goodman.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I'm sure the Prime Minister's confidence is well placed that were it necessary the EU would agree to our being an independent member of the WTO. But in that situation we'd also need the agreement of every member, including Russia. What price does she think they would extract?
Can I say to the honourable lady that, of course, we are a member of the WTO at the moment, but obviously we have that link with in relation to the European Union. In future, we will be wanting to be an independent member. We are working across the WTO to ensure that we are able to put in place the necessary arrangements for that to happen.
Jeremy Lefroy.
Mr Speaker, could I thank the Prime Minister for the huge amount of work that she's putting into these negotiations and say that I'm sure she has the support of the whole House as she does so. Could I also ask her whether she intends to ensure, as she in fact mentioned in her statement, that free flow of data is an absolute integral part of the future relationship between the UK and the EU, which we will get?
Yes, I'm very happy to give my honourable friend that reassurance. As I said when I was at the European Union Council, I believe that free flow of data is important for us in relation to the operations and particularly in building this digital single market. Another point that was made, that I and others in fact made, is that we shouldn't just look at the digital market as being about the European Union. Actually, this is a global issue, and we need to ensure that work is being done on a global basis on this.
Angela Smith.
Speaker, the Prime Minister has talked a great deal about an implementation deal. Now, we all know that we will be withdrawing in March 2019. There's no disagreement on that, the divorce deal. The free trade deal, however, may take some time to negotiate. Does the Prime Minister accept, and this is what business needs to hear, that a transition deal may help to deal with the finer detail and the final conclusion of a trade negotiation, and therefore will not be so much of an implementation but a proper transition?
Both sides on this recognise that the timetable was set out in the Lisbon Treaty, and it does indeed refer to the future relationship, and that the withdrawal agreement can only be considered and agreed in respect of or in taking account of the future relationship. I think it's important that we actually negotiate that future relationship so that we have both the withdrawal agreement and the future partnership, and the implementation period then is a practical implementation period. And the Honourable Lady looks as if she doesn't believe that that's possible. But of course the point is that we start these negotiations on a completely different basis from any other third country. We start on the basis that we are already trading with the other member states of the European Union on the basis of rules and regulations, and when we leave, we will have taken those EU regulations, EU law, the EU acquis, into UK law.
Yes, I think it's time to hear from the Honourable Gentleman Member for Huntington, whose father is a very sound Arsenal fan, Jonathan Ginogly.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Actually, he wishes to take me to Nottingham Forest, but there you are. I'd like to ask my right honourable friend whether, given the disappointment that we see consistently from the bureaucracy of Europe, in her discussions with the leadership of Europe, with the politicians, with the individual member states, is the position more nuanced? Is there hope for optimism here?
Prime Minister.
Yes, I can say to my honourable friend that I think there is hope for optimism. I think we need to, obviously, we are negotiating that future partnership. I think one of the interesting issues is that the EU27 are themselves, of course, starting to think about their future and the future nature of the sort of relationship they would have and the sort of arrangements that they would have in future. But what we are doing is obviously working to negotiate that deal. And at one sense, as I've just indicated in response to the honourable member for Penistone and Stockbridge, actually we know that we start on the same basis in negotiating this trade deal. We start on the same basis of trading, which will make it easier for us and doesn't have to be as bureaucratic as perhaps might be in other circumstances.
Paul Flynn.
As the prestigious Organisation for Economic Cooperation and Development reported last week that the British economy would be far stronger in the future without Brexit, and as we have new horrors revealed about Brexit on an almost weekly basis, isn't it right that 3 years after the referendum, when we're thinking of taking this step, we allow the public to have a second opinion on this, in the knowledge that second thoughts are always superior to first thoughts?
Can I say to the honourable gentleman that I think this is about more than a decision to leave the European Union. It's about whether the public can trust their politicians to put into place the decision that they have taken. And I suggest that any suggestion that we, in some sense, say to the public, oh, you better have a second referendum because we think you got it wrong, that is out of the question. We will be leaving the European Union.
Suella Fernandez.
Speaker, I welcome my right honourable friend's update and indeed the tone and manner with which she is representing the UK during these negotiations. Whilst no deal is obviously better than a bad deal, does my right honourable friend agree that, according to reports, now that the German Foreign Ministry is preparing a draft trade accord and the Swedish National Board of Trade is drawing up trade plans, there are real grounds for optimism that a mutually beneficial trade agreement can be struck which honours the instruction from the British people made last year?
Well, I absolutely agree with my honourable friend that there are indeed grounds for optimism that we will be able to move on to those detailed negotiations on trade and actually get that good trade deal. And it's precisely the point is, as she's illustrated in her question, it's because it matters to others in the European Union, not just to us. It's in both sides' interest to have that trade deal.
Jonathan Edwards.
Mr Speaker, with a third of the designated negotiating time already passed, is it not clear that the European Union holds the best cards? Would it not be far wiser for the British Government to perform a tactical retreat and base its position on permanent status within the customs union and the single market, instead of accelerating towards an uncertain destiny which costs jobs and further squeezes living standards?
No. First of all, the British people voted to leave the European Union, and that is what we will be doing. And that means we will no longer be full members of the customs union or of the single market. But we should be optimistic about the opportunities that will be open to the United Kingdom as a sovereign nation, not just with a good trade deal with the European Union, but also negotiating trade deals around the world.
Nigel Evans.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Does the Prime Minister believe that there are still too many refuseniks sitting on the benches opposite who find it impossible to come to terms with the result of the referendum, and that by their antics they not just undermine the bargaining position of the government, but indeed of the verdict of their own constituents? And the image of some of them crossing the Channel recently, paying homage to the Commission, holding a bowl of British taxpayers' money like some Oliver Twist in reverse, saying, "Please, sir, can we give you more?" was not just absurd, but was actually a slight to the British taxpayer.
Prime Minister.
I agree with my right honourable friend that I'm afraid all we hear from the benches opposite are speeches and questions and indeed votes that are intended to thwart the will of the British people. And what the British taxpayer wants is for this government to get on with the job, which is exactly what we're doing. And what they do not want is an opposition that says to the European Union, just tell us the bill and we'll pay whatever it is.
Tom Brake.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I thought that might be the timing. When is the Prime Minister going to face down the ideologues in her party, on her backbenches and indeed in her cabinet, who from the safety of their stately homes and their chateau, their trust funds and their inherited wealth clamour for a no deal that they know would do huge damage to the just about managing, leave the UK weaker and leave our position in the world much smaller? When is she going to stand up for Remain voters and indeed the Leave voters who do not want the economic catastrophe that the Eurosceptic obsessives on her benches want to inflict upon us?
Prime Minister.
I will tell the right honourable gentleman who I'm standing up for. I'm standing up for the British people who voted that we should leave the European Union. Unlike the Liberal Democrat Party, who want to tell the British people that they got the answer wrong. They didn't. We gave them the choice. They voted, and we will deliver it.
Martin Vickers.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Over the weekend, TV broadcasters and newspapers have repeatedly used a photograph where the German Chancellor and French President are covering their mouths. Viewers to Match of the Day will be familiar with this pose. It's usually used by managers and coaches on the bench when they don't want to see the opposition to see their change of tactics. Does my right honourable friend detect a change of tactics amongst our European colleagues? And does she think they've ruled out victory, fear defeat, or playing for a score draw?
Prime Minister.
Can I say to my honourable friend that indeed I do think, and we saw this from some of the comments that I quoted earlier from other European leaders, that the speech I gave in Florence has given a change in momentum and has been a spur to the negotiations and to the progress that was made at the European Union Council. I couldn't possibly comment on what Chancellor Merkel and President Macron were saying when they were talking to me in that manner.
Mrs. Louise Ellman.
Speaker. Today, the North West Business Leadership Team warned about the consequences of Brexit for jobs in the region, in particular for manufacturing jobs. Is the Prime Minister withholding information about the risks to manufacturing from a bad Brexit, or indeed any Brexit?
Prime Minister.
What I see is, as I've said, is optimism in terms of the trade deal that we can get for the future with the European Union, optimism about the trade deals that we can negotiate around the rest of the world, but also optimism about what we can do here in the UK through our modern industrial strategy to ensure that this is a country that works for everyone, that we do see jobs being created in the North West and in other parts of our country, and that we see those jobs, yes, in manufacturing, but also crucially in sectors that will be of the future, like artificial intelligence and driverless cars.
Dr. Sarah Wollaston.
Speaker, I welcome the Prime Minister's positive approach and the news that we're within touching distance of a deal, because that is in everyone's best interests. Yeah. However, in preparing for all eventualities, would the Prime Minister be prepared to reinstate the seasonal agricultural workers scheme? Because businesses in my constituency are really keen to plan ahead for all eventualities.
Prime Minister.
Well, of course, I was Home Secretary when the seasonal agricultural workers scheme stopped, and at that stage the Migration Advisory Committee was clear that they felt that it was not necessary to reintroduce a source scheme, at least for a period of time. But the Migration Advisory Committee has been asked by the current Home Secretary to look at issues across the UK economy as to where it is, as to the immigration needs across the UK economy, and I'm sure that that will indeed include the sector that my honourable friend has spoken about and whether or not a source scheme is necessary.
Mr. Kevin Brennan.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Did she hear the Foreign Secretary's attempt to be helpful following the European Council this morning by quoting Shakespeare, including "There's a tide in the affairs of men which taken at the flood lead on to fortune" from Julius Caesar, which was uttered by Brutus, who went on to stab his leader subsequently and came to a sticky end himself. Isn't that a perfect metaphor for her predicament?
Prime Minister.
I always welcome the literary and classical references that my right honourable friend brings to bear in his speeches and his statements, and he and I are both working to ensure we get the right deal for the United Kingdom when we leave.
Oliver Dowden.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I too was listening to the Foreign Secretary's speech, and I was heartened by his remarks in relation to Korea. I thank my right honourable friend for her update on those discussions at the European Council. Does she agree with me that as we leave the European Union, it is more important than ever that we reassure our important friends and allies in that region, such as Japan and the Philippines, that our support for them remains undimmed and indeed is stronger than ever?
Well, I'm very, very happy to give my honourable friend that reassurance. Indeed, indeed, I spoke to Prime Minister Shinzo Abe this morning to congratulate him on his victory, but also to reinforce the fact that we as the United Kingdom want to build and enhance our relationship with Japan. We will continue to work with them and other international partners to ensure that we get the right result in relation to stopping the DPRK from its illegal activities, but we also want a stronger defence and trade relationship with Japan in the future.
Mr. Barry Sherman.
Speaker, can I ask the Prime Minister, in terms of European security, in a week where Hillary Clinton reminded us how pleased the Russians are about Brexit and instability across Europe, was there a discussion in the Council about Russia's part in Europe and security of our nation going forward?
As I said in response to his right honourable friend, the member for Exeter, earlier, Russia was not a subject on the agenda of this European Union Council. It has been a subject on the agenda of the EU Council previously. We continue, and he talks about disruption across Europe. Well, of course, the Russians have indulged in disruptive activity, not just the illegal annexation of Crimea, but also the actions that they have taken in a number of countries in relation to their attempts to interfere in democratic elections in those countries. This is a subject that I'm sure the EU Council will return to.
Antoinette Sandbach.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My right honourable friend has outlined the progress that is being made in the negotiations. This is particularly important in the 80% export sector of this country in services. The service sector has no protection under WTO rules. Can my right honourable friend outline what assessment has been made about the impact on the service sector of no deal?
We are looking, as I said earlier, we're looking across, obviously, all parts of our economy in relation to the work that we're doing for the future. She is right to raise the issue of the services sector. This is a very important sector for the United Kingdom, obviously. It's an issue that is one of the key issues that we will be focusing on in relation to, obviously, the trade negotiations for the future. We've always been very clear this is about not just goods, but also about services. And obviously, we want to ensure that we retain the value of that service sector here in the United Kingdom, but also the world leadership that we have in many aspects of the services sector.
Stephen Giffins.
Mr. Speaker, the Brexit Secretary has been quite right when he says that it's so useful to be able to know that when Barnier speaks, he does so on behalf of a unified EU 27 in terms of the negotiations. If Barnier wants to know the unified position of the UK government, who should he speak to?
He knows it very well. It's in the Florence speech.
Stephen Hammond.
Speaker, can I thank my right honourable friend for her statement and welcome warmly the progress she's outlined towards the deal that both we and our European partners require. I also welcome the statement about EU citizens. Can I say that I note in her statement she says that there are a small number of issues that remain outstanding. Could you say what progress might be made in front of the December Council on those matters? Because resolution of that would represent a real Christmas present for many EU citizens in my constituency and elsewhere.
Yes,
Prime Minister.
As I say, I think both sides see the possible options for moving to that agreement, and I would hope that we can make rapid progress on that over the coming weeks to the December Council.
Clive Efford.
Mr. Speaker, the best contribution to the negotiations the government can make is a deep and special relationship with the fellow members of her cabinet. If we are within touching distance of an agreement, as she said several times, it is surprising that there are so many different positions coming out of her cabinet colleagues so close to the recent summit. So can she get a grip of her government, because that would be the most significant contribution to our negotiation position.
Well, can I say to the honourable gentleman, I use the phrase we're in touching distance of a deal in relation to the citizens' rights issue, where I think, as I've just indicated, in response to my honourable friend, the member for Wimbledon, there are a number of issues still on the table. I think we can see where we can go to ensure that we get that deal and that agreement. The government is very clear in the position we've taken into the negotiations. We've set it out I set it out in the Florence speech. That is setting that vision for the future deep and special partnership, and it is that vision that the European Union is now responding to.
Nigel Mills.
Welcome words in the conclusions about the need to have a fair and effective tax system where all companies across Europe
pay their share of taxes. Did the Prime Minister have the chance to urge the EU to follow the progress we've made on more transparency for multinational companies? And will she commit to extending that to overseas owners of UK properties?
Prime Minister.
My honourable friend raises an interesting point. Can I say to him that we have made clear to the European Union, of course, the work that the UK has done on this in the past. There was a particular discussion on this issue in relation to the digital market, but a recognition also in the European Union that, as we have always said, and the efforts that we've put into this in the past, this is an issue that has to be looked at on a global scale and not just within the European Union.
Mr. Ian Murray.
Mr. Speaker, surely the Prime Minister must recognise the concerns of business leaders with regards to the lack of progress on at least a transitional deal when they're having to make decisions about investment and jobs in this country over the next 18 months to 2 years. So what message does the Prime Minister think it sends out to the people who create jobs and wealth in this country when her Cabinet is completely split on whether or not there should be a no-deal cliff-edge scenario?
The government is working to ensure that we get the best possible deal for the United Kingdom. That's where our efforts are being focused, and that's what we will continue to do. I set out the implementation period in my Florence speech. As I indicated earlier in response to a question, this is an issue that was alluded to by the European Council and the Commission in the April guidelines that were set out. So this is a matter on which I believe we can make progress because it is in both sides' interests.
Mr. Robert Neal.
May I thank the Prime Minister for her statement and the constructive progress that's been made, and in particular her reference in reply to my honourable friend and member for Sandbach to the importance and significance of financial services.
Yes,
Member for Edinburgh. Which is remarkably close to Sandbach.
That's true.
In doing so, I speak, of course, as a lowly West Ham supporter, Mr. Speaker.
Yeah.
But in doing so, will she bear in mind the importance that our Crown Territory of Gibraltar makes to financial services, where it strongly complements the City of London? The Chief Minister is in London today, as she will know, and will be celebrating the links later on today. Will she make sure that Gibraltar's interests are firmly taken on board, both in relation to financial services, professional services, and the operation of a free-flowing border as we go forward in negotiations?
Yes, I'm happy to give my honourable friend that assurance. We've been very clear we have been keeping the Gibraltar Government in touch with the work that we have been doing, and we continue to work with them. And we have assured them, and will continue to do so, that we will take their interests into account at every stage.
Mr. Alan Brown.
Here. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. A week after the universal...
Thing I said. Let's hear the honourable gentleman.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. A week after the universal credit debate debacle, the Prime Minister has the cheek to come to this chamber and use the phrase that she's determined to put people first. Now, the reality is we're 16 months down the line and there's yet no agreement on settled status for EU nationals. Now, given that's her #1 priority, this does not bode well for the rest of the negotiations we're trusting her with. However, if we are in touching distance of an agreement for settled status, what plans does she have in process to be able to process up to 3 million applications?
This is a matter that the Home Office is putting the necessary arrangements into place. Can I say to the honourable gentleman that we have set out very clearly what we believe the arrangements for the future in relation to settled status for EU citizens here in the United Kingdom must be, but in putting people first, we must not just put EU citizens in the UK first, we must also put UK citizens in the rest of the European Union first, and that's why it's necessary for us to ensure that their rights are also being guaranteed.
Mark Pawsey.
Mr. Speaker, the Prime Minister will have seen the recent EEF survey of companies' future investment plans, and would she agree that this underlines how important it is for business that we get on to discussing trade arrangements at the earliest opportunity?
Well, I absolutely agree with my honourable friend. That's why I set out in my Florence speech what our future trade relationship could be like, so that that has elicited a response from the European Union 27, and they are now preparing for negotiations on that trade relationship.
Dr. Rupa Huck.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can I just say what fine fettle the Prime Minister appears to be in, given that there were German media reports at the weekend suggesting she was the opposite, must have been lost in translation. But anyway, look, does she share the concern of my constituents who work in the City of London at the declaration of the CEO of Goldman Sachs that he's going to be spending a lot more time in Frankfurt after all this? And similar musings have come out of JP Morgan and Morgan Stanley. So what is she doing to stem the brain drain and corporate exodus that faces our great capital?
Of course, Prime Minister, to ensure that the City of London retains its place as the world's leading financial centre. That has been reconfirmed recently. And what I would say to those who think that the City of London will be damaged by us leaving the European Union is that the very reasons why the city is so important in an international financial sense are the very reasons why it is important for the city to retain that financial services provision for the rest of the European Union as well.
Raymond Chishti.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Page 7 of the conclusions refers to combating terrorism and online crime and readiness to support appropriate measures at EU level. Germany is introducing legislation to have extremist material taken down within 24 hours. Is that something the United Kingdom will be doing and urging other European countries to do so, as we are all in it together to defeat this poison ideology?
Well, the taking down of material is very important, as my honourable friend has said, and through the Counter-Terrorism Internet Referral Unit, we have been taking down significant amounts of material. What my right honourable friend, the Home Secretary, has done is working with the tech industry, with the internet service providers. They have established a global forum. We want to ensure that this material is taken down not within 24 hours, but actually within 2 hours, 1 or 2 hours. And that's what we're working to with the industry.
Gary McCarthy.
Mr. Speaker, did the Prime Minister have a chance over dinner with Michel Barnier to discuss the fact that he is soon to meet leaders of the core cities in the UK to discuss Brexit negotiations? Does she welcome the fact that he's willing to meet the representatives of 19 million people? And doesn't she think it's rather rude of the Brexit Secretary not to be prepared to do so himself?
Quite right. Well, I have to say to the Honourable Lady that I'm aware that Michel Barnier is meeting a number of people here in the United Kingdom and elsewhere around Europe to discuss these issues. But the Brexit Secretary himself has indeed put in place arrangements for meeting the Metro Mayors to ensure that the interests of people who are represented by those Metro Mayors are taken into account.
Simon Clarke.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Businesses on Teesside will give a warm welcome to her announcement that we're closer than ever to a deal, which is obviously great news and very important that we do so as quickly as possible. However, does she agree with me and with so many of my constituents that Labour's position that no deal is not an option represents not so much negotiation as capitulation?
I absolutely agree with my honourable friend. It's important that it is very clear when we go into these negotiations that we want to get a good deal, we want to get the best deal for both sides, but that actually, if it is necessary, as I've said before, no deal is better than a bad deal.
Mr. Peter Grant.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The EU citizens I've spoken to since they received the Prime Minister's email a week or two ago have taken no reassurance whatsoever from it. Will the Prime Minister not accept that when she appears to make concessions to EU nationals, what matters is not how loudly her own backbenchers cheer, but how reassured those 3 million people actually feel. And at the moment, they are not reassured at all by her email.
Minister. I say to the honourable gentleman that of course I recognise that what we want to do is to ensure that we get to an arrangement with the European Union where we are able to guarantee the rights of the EU citizens living here in the UK. I want them to stay. I value the contribution that they have made. I recognise that they will want reassurance. That was precisely why I indicated the various issues that I did in the email and the article that I wrote about their future here in the United Kingdom. But of course we also want to ensure that the rights of UK citizens living in the EU are guaranteed as well. And I'm sure that the honourable gentleman, as a Member of Parliament of the United Kingdom, would want to give reassurance to UK citizens living elsewhere in Europe.
Mr. Richard Graham.
Speaker, I congratulate the Prime Minister on taking the talks on citizens' rights so close to a touching distance of a deal. The logic of an implementation period, it partly implies time to prepare for our future trading relationships with Europe and elsewhere. Could my right honourable friend confirm that during the implementation period we will be able to negotiate both the cloning of existing EU free trade agreements and any new arrangements with other countries so that as many as possible become effective on day one after the end of the implementation period?
I thank my honourable friend for raising an important point. It is indeed our intention to be able to ensure that during that implementation period we are able to conduct those negotiations so that we are in the position when we reach that end state, that future partnership, that we can open those trade arrangements with the other nations around the world.
Mrs. Madeleine Moon.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. There are two sets of documents that it would be helpful if the Prime Minister would release to the House while we look at the European Union withdrawal bill. Would she be willing to release the potential impact studies that show how Brexit will impact across departments and across the UK? And also the legal advice relating to the powers that are going to be assumed by this House for the devolved administrations, many of whom feel that this House has no responsibility for areas of subjects that are within their purview. Would you release those documents, please?
Well, can I say to the
Prime Minister,
when she talks about the whole issue of devolution and the arrangements with the devolved administrations, we've been very clear about the issue. We want to ensure that powers that are currently within Brussels, when they're brought back to the UK, that we have that discussion and that negotiation about those where we need to ensure we have UK frameworks in place. I see that her front bench is suggesting that, in fact, those powers should be devolved immediately to the Northern Ireland, where there's an executive, to Scotland and to Wales. And of course what that could lead to is a break-up of the UK internal market, the very internal market which is of most importance to those devolved administrations.
Rachel McLean.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And on behalf of the EU citizens in my constituency of Redditch, who I know firsthand have welcomed the Prime Minister's commitments and her remarks, and I'm delighted that she's made a very practical statement about the cost of the settled status being no greater than a British passport. This will also be welcomed. And can she also consider the issue of the documents needed to actually apply for the settled status, which could be very difficult for someone that has migrated to this country? That will also give them reassurance.
Well, my honourable friend raises an important practical point. I know a number of EU citizens are concerned about that process of applying for settled status and how bureaucratic that will be. And that's why the Home Office is working to make that as light touch and streamlined as possible so that people can have the reassurance that this will not be a difficult process that they will have to enter into.
Paul Sweeney.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Prime Minister stated her intention to create a new partnership with the European Union after Brexit that was built on shared fundamental values such as democracy, the rule of law, free trade, rigorous and fair competition, strong consumer rights and high regulatory standards. But would the Prime Minister also agree with me that the hard-won and hard-fought for workers' rights that we have built within the European Union are also critical to that shared fundamental value, and we should uphold those after Brexit?
Prime Minister.
That this government not only wants to maintain workers' rights but enhance workers' rights. And I am very surprised that the honourable gentleman should ask that question, given that the Labour Party voted against the very bill, the EU withdrawal bill, that will bring EU workers' rights and EU law into UK law.
Robert Jenrick.
Speaker, one of the first things that I learned at law school in contract law was that you can't have an agreement to agree. That is, entering into an obligation to enter a future agreement, the terms of which you don't know at the time you signed the first one. So would my right honourable friend the Prime Minister agree with me that it's legally ridiculous and a terrible negotiating position to try to amend the EU withdrawal bill to make no deal a legal impossibility and to force us to have an implementation agreement on a deal we don't know the contents of?
Prime Minister.
I bow to my honourable friend's legal knowledge on this particular issue, but I think he's absolutely right. Certainly if we look at the issue of an implementation period, that is, as my right honourable friend the member for Chingford indicated earlier, about practical arrangements to reach the future partnership. You don't know what those practical arrangements are until you know what that future partnership is.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Last week we had two significant announcements. Firstly, we heard from Peugeot Citroën that they preferred to reduce the number of jobs here in the UK, preferring actually to maintain their investment and job levels in mainland Europe. We also heard from Lloyd Blankfein, who announced that he, like many other business leaders, would be spending more time in Europe. Do these two announcements concern the Prime Minister?
I say we are, of course, working with business to ensure that we can get the right arrangement for our future trade relationship and for the implementation period to give business the certainty that they have asked for. But I'm optimistic not just about that trade relationship, but also about the other trade agreements we can negotiate around the world. And I'm optimistic about the opportunities for the economy and for firms here in the United Kingdom, not least because of the modern industrial strategy this government's putting in place.
Matt Warman.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. There is a lot of talk of deals and no deals. Is it not a crucial distinction that the Prime Minister has shown total commitment to a deal on Northern Ireland, on citizens' rights, on security and on a host of other issues, but where she is rightly sceptical is on whether a punishment deal is better than no deal on trade?
Well, my honourable friend is absolutely right. And I think this is where the Labour Party gets it absolutely wrong, that they think that they should be signing up to any deal, across the whole board, actually, regardless of the price and regardless of the conditions that are applied by the European Union.
Mr. Patrick Grady.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I wonder if she was able to share any of the perspectives of the devolved administrations with the other governments at the summit, particularly the concerns around the EU withdrawal bill. And given that the Secretary of State for Scotland has promised a powers bonanza for Holyrood, I wonder if she could name today just one power that will definitely be devolved to Holyrood after Brexit.
Prime Minister.
Don't worry, we will be making clear the, where we expect further devolution to take place. He asked whether I discussed the EU withdrawal bill with the European Union Council. I have to say the EU withdrawal bill is a matter for this Parliament, and it's this Parliament that will decide on it.
Charlie Elphick.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can I congratulate my right honourable friend on her excellent statement on contingency planning being ready on day one? Would she agree that money invested in that is money well invested as an insurance policy? Well invested is giving us a stronger hand in the negotiations, but also well invested as no regrets investment in our world-class customs systems, world-class border systems and resilient roads that do not need to have the kind of gridlock the party opposite hoped for.
Well, I absolutely agree with my honourable friend, and in fact, some of the work that is being done on contingency arrangements will apply regardless of the nature of the outcome, whether there's a deal or not a deal.
Andrew Bridgen.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I was disappointed with the European Council that on this occasion they didn't find the time to discuss the ongoing appalling situation in Venezuela. Does my right honourable friend believe that this was to spare the blushes of the Leader of the Opposition, who apparently was in town working with the EU to undermine the UK's negotiating position?
Well, I have to say to my honourable friend that that may very well indeed have been the case, and I know that the Leader of the Opposition was in town at the time, and of course what he was doing was basically saying to the European Union that he'd be willing to take any deal at any price. That's not the position of this
Stuart Malcolm MacDonald.
I'm starting to think it's the Christmas cards I'm sending, Mr. Speaker. You know how to give me a complex. Having relegated EU nationals to spectator status in this entire debate, and she shakes her head, but she voted to exclude them from the referendum. Doesn't she think it's at best a tad gauche, if not outright rude, to charge them 70-odd quid in order to settle a status they had no hand in offering in the first place?
We will be, as part of the negotiations, we will be ensuring that we get those guarantees for EU citizens here in the UK and putting into place here in the UK the arrangements necessary to ensure that they are able to get that settled status, because we value the contribution they've made here in the UK.
Steve Double.
you, Mr. Speaker. I wonder, does the Prime Minister share my view that one of the factors that may well have contributed to the progress recently made was the fact that the EU has come to understand that the UK is not afraid of a no-deal outcome? And does this show why, to continue progress and focus minds, no deal has to stay on the table?
I think my honourable friend is right. We, of course, are working to get a deal and to get the best deal for the United Kingdom. But we have to be very clear that we are prepared to say that no deal is an option if we're not able to get that good deal for the UK.
Nigel Huddleston.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. You've saved me a trip to the gym today. Does the Prime Minister agree that in order to better represent the interests of EU citizens, that the EU negotiators could benefit from a remedial course in economics, so they can understand the difference between a £70 billion surplus and a £70 billion deficit, because they seem to be getting it the wrong way round at the moment?
Well, I think my honourable friend makes a very important point, which just emphasises that the deal that we're working towards is actually going to be to the benefit of the European Union as well as the UK.
Mr. Michael Tomlinson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Thank you, and I warmly welcome the Prime Minister's statement. And in contrast to honourable members from the SNP, I warmly welcome her comment and commitment to EU citizens, her commitment to putting people first, and her letter, her open letter of last week. Could I urge her to continue to do so, because this is so important not just to EU citizens, but to UK citizens living and working in the EU?
Well,
Prime Minister.
Absolutely right. I was being clear from the start that we needed to make this one of the early agreements that we came to. It was part of the very first stage of the negotiations. As I say, we're in touching distance of a deal, but it's important not just to EU citizens here, but also to UK citizens who've made their home elsewhere in the European Union.
Thank you. Order. No. Point of order, Amanda Milling.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Over the weekend, there were various posts on social media and in the press that we might be able to have an important debate about misogyny and degrading language towards women, which I am sure, Mr. Speaker...
Order. I don't think this is going to be a point of order for the Chair, and I did indicate to another member who made a wholly absurd and inappropriate application for an SA24 debate that she shouldn't raise it as a point of order. But I'll hear the honourable lady out, but I'm very uncertain, to put it mildly, that it's a responsibility of the Chair. Maybe very important, but that's a very different matter from being a matter for the Chair. So all I would say to the honourable lady, I will hear her out, as I always do, please don't abuse the point of order procedure. Don't abuse the point of order procedure. That is not something to be done in this chamber. And order. And I don't take such a matter lightly, but if the honourable lady is in order, I'll hear her.
I'm very grateful, Mr. Speaker, and I'd actually like to seek your advice in that case, in terms of how we can bring this debate to the House, and I'd seek your advice on that.
If the honourable lady wants to apply for an adjournment debate for a matter which falls within the aegis of a government minister, it is open to her to do so. Members can table motions in this place, as the honourable lady, now a relatively experienced member of the House, will be well aware, but that's different from a point of order, which this matter is not, or indeed the other form of exchange, which it most assuredly was not. So I hope that's a helpful clarification to the honourable lady, who will use her adroit parliamentary skills to highlight such matter as she wishes in an orderly way. Thank you. Point of order, Dr. Julian Lewis.
Mr. Speaker, when you replied to my honourable friend for Totnes about certain committees, including the Liaison Committee and the Intelligence and Security Committee that have not yet been constituted, you didn't mention on your list another one that's not yet been constituted, which is the Joint Committee on the National Security Strategy. Since hearing your strong response to that earlier point of order, I have received a letter from the National Security Advisor, Mark Sedwill, declining to appear about the review of national security capabilities before the Defence Committee, because he points out, not unreasonably, as you note in your letter, the established procedure is that I appear before the Joint Committee on the National Security Strategy on these issues. Although it has not yet been constituted, you are an ex officio member. So what can I do to perhaps turn to practical advantage being an ex officio member of a committee that has not yet been constituted this far into the new Parliament?
The short answer to the right honourable gentleman is that the best thing he can do is seek to persuade his colleagues who are in a position, in a matter of days, to facilitate the establishment of those committees, to do so without further delay. Traditionally, I don't think it will be objected to, certainly not by any serious whip, if I say that the whips have not regarded it as their prime concern to establish select committees to scrutinise the executive of which they are the defenders. That is to put it mildly. However, they do have a responsibility in this matter, and of course the Leader of the House, as the House's representative in the government, has a particular responsibility, supported by members opposite, the Shadow Leader of the House and the Opposition Chief Whip, to bring about the constitution of these committees. For those who weren't here earlier, the matter was raised in respect of the Liaison Committee, and I pointed out that the same concern applied to the European Scrutiny Committee and to the Intelligence and Security Committee, not in fact a select committee, but a very important committee. The right honourable gentleman has now identified how it applies with such force to the Joint Committee on the National Security Strategy. He's also explained how the failure to constitute the committee has effectively created a void for an important potential witness. This is now, frankly, an embarrassment, and it needs to be sorted, preferably this week. Point of order, Mr. William Wiggin.
Further to your point of order and your ruling, Mr. Speaker, knowing as you do that whips aren't able to speak, I felt it might be helpful if I was to say that I suspect there's going to be very good news on this subject in the foreseeable future. However, I believe the usual channels are stuck, and there are certain names that the opposition parties need to return to the government.
Well, I don't know about that. The honourable gentleman says from the honourable gentleman says in the course of his contribution that whips can't speak. Well, they're not supposed to speak. That is true. It doesn't stop them now and again doing so, sometimes from a sedentary position in a more or indeed less orderly fashion. As to the subject of disputed names, that's not something with which the honourable gentleman would expect the Speaker to preoccupy himself. My concern is simply to facilitate the constitution of the committees, which are those of Parliament, and which I suspect most members on both sides of the House want to see established. In short, let's get on with it. Order. I shall call in a moment the Shadow Secretary of State for Work and Pensions to make an application for leave to propose a debate on a specific and important matter that should have urgent consideration under the terms of Standing Order number 24. The honourable member has up to 3 minutes in which to make such an application. Debbie Abrahams.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I seek leave to propose that the House should debate a specific and important matter that should have urgent consideration. Namely, that this House has considered the matter of the Government's response to the decision of the House on pausing rollout of universal credit full service. May I first thank you, Mr. Speaker, for allowing this important application, which arises, as you know, after a decisive vote on a motion to pause universal credit rollout, supported by this House last week by 299 votes to 0. This was the second such government defeat on an opposition day motion in 40 years, Mr. Speaker. Since then, we have heard nothing from the government, despite the fact that after the last time this happened, the government made a statement within 3.5 hours. Worse still, in business questions the day after the government's resounding defeat, the Leader of the House used a change to government policy on the phone lines of universal credit made before the vote last week as a justification for refusing to inform the House as to when we might expect a further statement on this matter. I would like to thank the many honourable and right honourable friends on this side of the House who have pressed the government for a statement, as well as the member for Gainsborough and the member for Wellingborough on the government benches for their remarks on the constitutional issues the lack of a statement exposes the government to. Mr. Speaker, one of the few formal rights the opposition parties is to decide the topic and the motions for debate on 20 sitting days. All previous governments have recognised that the failure to carry the House against an opposition motion is a serious rebuke to the government's policy on an issue and has been treated accordingly. This is even more important when the House has spoken on an issue that could dramatically affect the lives of up to 7 million people. And they are the people who will be subject to the flawed universal credit programme. I thank you once again, Mr. Speaker, for considering this application.
Order. I've listened carefully to the application from the honourable member. I am satisfied that the matter raised is proper to be discussed under Standing Order number 24. Has the honourable member the leave of the House?
They're all off.
The honourable member has obtained the leave of the House. The debate will be held, thank you, the debate will be held tomorrow, Tuesday the 24th of October, as the first item of public business. The debate will last for 3 hours and will arise on a motion that the House has considered the specific